If you have a family, if you have a wife, if you have an intimate relationship, and you're discussing something that's difficult, the probability that you're not going to offend each other if you're actually having the conversation is zero. And so you don't have to think unless you have a problem. And if you have a problem, then when you think, you're going to offend people. And so what, are we not going to think? That seems like a bad idea.
Yeah. You're obviously not an American. We love to not think.
Well, I think parents are afraid of exercising authority because they tend to think that authority will crush the creative spirit of their child.
Oh, fuck.
Well, that is...
Okay. No, I see, everything this man says, I think is common sense.
You guys should have a baby together.
Yeah, we should have a baby together.
There's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So, I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect.
But excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. On average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer. You have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice.
If I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.
Do you like that, being controversial? Do you enjoy provoking groups like?
No, and I don't provoke people. I just say what I think. I just say what I believe to be true. Well, I don't.
Have you ever been online?
I say what I believe to be true, and people find that provoking. That's not the same as me provoking people. If I was provoking people, I would be setting out to upset them, and I'm not setting out to upset them. I'm just setting out to say what I believe to be true. And I'm a very...
So you're following the rule we talked about?
Yes, and when I'm talking about gender issues, for example, in personality, that's actually one of my fields of expertise. I know the literature, and it says exactly what I said it says.
You are a conservative at heart, aren't you?
Not particularly. I don't have the temperament for it. So, for example, conservative people tend to be low in trait openness, which is associated with creativity, and I'm very high in trait openness. And so, temperamentally, I'm not much of a conservative at all. And people who knew me, people who come to my house, would certainly not think that I was a conservative person. So, or if they saw the breadth of my ideas, I'm also very entrepreneurially minded, which also is not associated with conservatism. I am a great skeptic of well-meaning attempts to adjust large social systems on the basis of ideology. But that doesn't make me conservative. It just makes me educated social scientist.
So when are you provoked yourself?
When am I provoked myself? Oh, being called a Nazi I find somewhat provoking. that I think one of the most
didn't do
absurd
that.
days. No, certainly not. One of the most absurd days in my life in the last 2 years, and there's been plenty of them, was a day probably 3 months ago where I was accused by one magazine in the UK of being a Jewish shill and another magazine in the United States of being an alt-right Nazi. I thought, well, that's it. I pretty much covered both ends of the insult spectrum.
Balance.
It's like, yeah, that's right. So you can average that out to zero, I suppose. We do know that stable, intact, two-parent families are better for children. So, it depends on who you put first. And look, I'm not saying that everyone who's got divorced is reprehensible. I understand that life is very difficult and that it's a very hard thing to maintain a relationship over a very long period of time. But it's not obvious to me that we're better off for the additional plethora of choices. So we'll see.
But isn't that an individual choice and not something the law should decide?
Well, it depends to some degree on whether the law should advocate for children. I mean, children really can't speak for themselves, can they? They need some authority to speak for them. And so we do know, like the data, for example, on child welfare indicates it's crystal clear that children from intact two-parent families do better on virtually every measure that you can possibly imagine.
So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. Let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, being concerned about global warming. It's like, one of the reasons there's more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated.
I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because they just don't, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal politely.